All right. So the next section we're going to talk about, this section is called Whitewashing U.S. History, and we're just going to kind of talk about a little bit about what what whitewashing is and what it looks like, and then we're going to talk about a couple examples. It's definitely not going to be a comprehensive list. This whole entire course I'm doing, the 24 class course, all of it is about kind of unearthing whitewashed history and bringing back the real history and different perspectives and the bottom up history. So but this is just, we're just going to give a couple examples and kind of talk about different ways that the history is whitewashed. So I really like this. John Hennessy, the chief historian of the National Military Park, writes, "The greatest enemy to good public health, or public history, sorry, is omission. We are experiencing as a society now the collateral damage that's forgetting can inflict." So we're going to talk more about this, but omission, whitewashing by omission, like leaving important details or important perspectives out, which like we mentioned earlier, like the New Deal. New Deal was this great legislation that helped out a lot of people and got us out of the depression, and at the same time it was only for white people. So if you leave that last detail out, you're kind of you're whitewashing history. You're creating a much more fake history that is going to actually help people. It's going to push people in a different direction. If you don't know about the history of discrimination and racial inequities and racial wealth gaps and things, if you don't know about that, then you're not going to support any kind of legislation or politicians that are going to try to fix that. And that's what we're seeing now today, is because of this lack of history. We have a lot of support for politicians that want to oppose anything that tries to fix past harm. All right, but I want to start out reading this really great quote. I'll just start reading it. It's no accident that you learned about Helen Keller, but not W.E.B. Du Bois. You learn about the Watts and L.A. riots, but not Tulsa or Wilmington. You learn about George Washington's dentures were made of wood rather than the teeth of slaves. You learn about black ghettos, but not about Black Wall Street. You learn about Christopher Columbus discovered America, but not that his conquest also involved raping young girls and women. You learn about the New Deal, but not redlining. You learn from Tommy Smith's fist in the air at the 1968 Olympics, but not that he was sent home the next day stripped of his medals. You learned that Rosa Parks sat on a bus, but not about her decade of activist work that led to that moment. You learn about black crime, but white criminals were never lumped together and discussed in terms of their race. You learn about states' rights as the cause of the Civil War, but not that slavery was mentioned 80 times in the Articles of Secession. You learn about the exploration of a few white men and little to nothing about the cultures they explored. You learned that interracial relationships became illegal in 1967, but not that white men had an unofficial yet socially acceptable right to rape black women for 400 years previous. You learned that about the Declaration of Independence, but not that it also declares an inherent right to wage war against merciless Indian savages. You know about affirmative action for non-white college students, but have no idea about how the GI Bill provided the same exact benefits only to whites decades earlier. Privilege includes having history rewritten so that you don't have to acknowledge the uncomfortable facts. Racism and oppression are perpetuated by people who refuse to learn about or acknowledge this reality. You have a choice. And like just going through that, like, I mean, this, there was not one thing, like looking back to my, childhood history or my childhood education and history, I would say that, not one of those lines was incorrect for at least for my childhood. Every one of those, I learned about Helen Keller, but not W. Du Bois. I learned about Watts riots, but I never learned about Tulsa and Wilmington, pogroms until much later. I learned, same with I learned about black ghettos, but not Black Wall Street. All these things. So this is a big form of what we're talking about, missions. Like teaching one aspect of it, but only one view and one perspective, and leaving out very important, the uncomfortable details. So whitewashing, just to give a clear definition, is to gloss over, omit, or cover up crimes, negative histories, or negative realities. It's also to exonerate by means of perfunctory investigation, biased presentation of data, omission, or false narratives. And it's also assimilating to white Eurocentric culture as well. So, there's lots of examples. We're going to talk about different examples. Some like key big ones are like American exceptionalism. This idea of American exceptionalism is that, America is really, has not done really anything wrong. We've always had the best intentions, bad things may have happened, but we overcame them. It's all been this like steady progress. We're making a better country. And in reality, that's just not true. We have quite a lot that's wrong with this country right now. And that's, there's a lot that's good with this country too, but it doesn't help to ignore the bad things. It doesn't help to just, pretend like everything's good with this country. Because what we really need to do, we need to, actively be making this a better country. So we need to talk about the good and bad. And then, another like Eurocentric education, teaching European history as a requirement, but then African history as an elective, is a great way of whitewashing, making, our culture more Eurocentric. So here's a couple examples from this really great Instagram account. If you don't follow it, it's So You Want to Talk About, and they have all different kinds of really awesome mini lessons. But I found this, just as like a couple of examples of ways that we whitewash, really common ways. For example, like Jesus. So Jesus was a man in the Middle East. There's no way that he was a white man. It's just not possible. He would have been the only white man for like a millennial in this area. It would, it's just not possible. Yet you go to every single church across this country, like 99%, and Jesus is a white man on the cross. And that is intentional, even though that, after a while people say, oh, well, that's just like tradition, that's just whatever. But that started out as very intentional. It's very intentional, making, the savior of the human race, as being white, and that's because, religion, particularly Christianity, Europeans and later Americans used Christianity to justify a lot of white supremacy policies and colonial policies, and they used it as like, well, even though we're doing horrific things like enslaving people, we're also bringing civilization and we're bringing Christianity, and so they purposely, meant this as like, they created this religion as a white European religion to give them the moral authority to do the horrific things that they did. So this is very intentional that Jesus is this white man. Same with Christopher Columbus, which we talked already a lot about Columbus. Talk about Abraham Lincoln, outlawed Emancipation Proclamation, outlawed slavery, but in reality, it really was a constitutional amendment, the 13th Amendment, that outlawed some slavery, but left this huge loophole for involuntary servitude, which allowed which created our very racist criminal justice system. It was created out of this loophole to continue different forms of slavery, and still to this day, we have forms of slavery occurring in this country through this loophole. So saying that he outlawed all slavery is a whitewash history. Same with this is not George Bush. A lot of people. It's funny we talk about this. It seems petty, but it's like that Ellen DeGeneres, it was like last year, was talking, defending George, being friends with George Bush and saying, oh, I just, I don't want, I think we should all, reach out to each other despite the fact that we have different opinions. And a lot of people, rightly so, pushed back on that and was pretty outraged, because he basically summarized creating making up lies about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq so we could bomb them and kill roughly 250,000 people in the Middle East. And that is that's already been whitewashed. Most of the people that were on Ellen DeGeneres' side had already completely, or didn't realize that George Bush would create lies, or just completely forgotten about it already, because it's not an important part of our history anymore. But in reality, like, he 100% created these lies. It's a well documented fact in the academic world that he created multiple lies around weapons of mass destruction, about connections to Al Qaeda, in order to push this fabricated war that ended up making a lot of his neocon buddies a lot of money. So it's important to understand. um, this isn't like, this isn't always something that happened a long time ago with Jesus or with Abraham Lincoln or Christopher Columbus. This is something that a lot of times, a lot of our whitewash history, this was, less than 2 decades ago. And yeah, I would argue majority of people do not know that, George Bush is actually considered a war criminal for making up lies that caused the war that killed hundreds of thousands of people. But anyway. And then here's another really great Instagram account that talks about a couple other different things. They call it, whitewashing, revising history. But they talk about this idea that the civil rights movement, we teach that it was this beautiful movement. A lot of people came together. There was some Bull Connors and stuff, and some, dangerous, Jim Crow, KKK people. For the most part, everybody was on board, and it was this beautiful, movement. In reality, the majority of white people, oppose the civil rights movement. It's much like how, you see this opposition to the Black Lives Matters movement, which is our modern civil rights movement. There's this poll that they did, and polling people about, do you think the mass demonstrations, by the Black activists, do they help or hurt, the cause for racial equality? And this is a Gallup poll, and majority of people in this country, I would say majority white people, considered, these demonstrations actually hurting their cause, just like a lot of people look at Black Lives Matter as hurting their cause. So we don't get this like fun, beautiful memory of the civil rights movements until much afterwards, when we kind of whitewash the real opposition. There was a lot of opposition, from white people. There were a lot of white resistance, from just nasty looks to pretty horrific violence. But a lot of that is whitewashed. And like the suffragists, another point on the bottom, we talk about this like great suffrage movement that ultimately in 1921 gained women's right to vote. But there's a caveat that that this was only for mainly white women. Indigenous women and Black women had a lot of barriers. Technically, it was legal for them to vote, but or at least for Black women. For Indigenous women, it took a while for them to be legal to vote. But Black women, were still dealing with Jim Crow, still dealing with the fact that 99% of the people in the South were blocked from voting. Black people were blocked from voting. So, and I mean, a lot of the suffragists, there was actually a small group of Black suffragists. They had to march, in the back of the parades. They were, treated like crap. Often, a lot of these suffragists, leaders were yes, they were great feminist warriors, but they were also pretty racist. And a lot of them saw the fact that the Black, man was getting the right to vote before the woman. They saw that as a horrific thing, buying into this like Black criminality. So there was a lot, and then like Ida B. Wells and all these Black suffragists, after the women's right, the vote. After they won the right to vote in the 1920, they asked, for women, these suffragists to come down to the South and work against overthrowing Jim Crow, and they couldn't get anyone to join. So it's very misleading to say that women got the right to vote. White women got the right to vote in 1920. Black women didn't get the right to vote till 1965 with the Voter Rights Act. Again, these minor details of omission, but they've really changed the bigger story. Same with this idea that Martin Luther King, that everyone loved Martin Luther King, and he had such a peaceful movement that brought everyone together. In reality, this country treated Martin Luther King like shit. Like, the FBI was considered him one of the most dangerous people, like sent him death threats. Majority of the people, white people, did not have a favorable opinion on them. And it wasn't until much afterwards when his like whole image was kind of whitewashed. We'll talk more about that towards the end of this section. And then we start seeing people, appreciate Martin Luther King, start naming memorials after him in streets and things. But that was only after we watered down his message to this, all we need is love kind of thing, instead of, reparations and economic restructuring. But so here's just a couple examples. And another concept I want to talk about, presentism versus whitewashing. So we talked a little bit about this in this section in previous classes as well. Presentism, sorry, is this idea that we shouldn't judge people back in the day using the same standards that we have today. So like, even though I think it's horrific that people, today would enslave others, I shouldn't judge people, our founding fathers, because it was much more common and socially acceptable to enslave people back in that day. And Michael Harry, I already read this once, but I'll read it again. He has this great comment, retort to that. It says, as if white people of the past couldn't quite grasp the idea of inhumanity and brutality until 1861. And so I'm not going to argue against that, presentism. Like if you want to believe that, that's great. If you don't, if you think, we should be objective when looking at our past, or we should be critical, whatever, it's your choice. But one thing I do want to argue is a lot of times people use presentism to justify whitewashing, and that we need to understand that these two concepts are not the same. We still, even if we don't want to judge people, we still need to say, accurately depict what was happening. For example, in this meme by the same person who wrote that last, Cecilia Stanton, she got a lot of great information if you're looking for someone to follow on Instagram. She wrote, consider this sentence: Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. It's not not too much to unpack there, versus Thomas Jefferson was a human trafficker who kidnapped and held Black people captive, forcing them to complete unpaid and brutal labor. So one of these sentences can be found in a high school history book. Which one do you think it is? Our history books intentionally use language to trick us into believing our history is normal. It's not. We cannot own people, and a slave is not something that a person can be. So, so that's like the second, looking at both these instances, if we really want to talk about what it means to own slaves, it wasn't just, he just owned some property back then, no, he can, he owned kidnapped people and forced them to work in brutal labor, raping many of them, disciplining many of them, hunting them down when they were trying to escape for their freedom. We could, this isn't us judging them. This is us accurately depicting what he was saying. Like Thomas Jefferson, he fathered like 7 or 8 children from one of his enslaved people, Sally Hemings. This whole controversy, was it rape? Was it not rape? It was rape. She was 14 years old. She was in bondage from him. And he often used, when he took her to Paris and she had a chance to actually, a bunch of people were petitioning for her freedom. She had a chance. And he told her, he used, the fact that he had one of his kids, she was pregnant at the time with his first kid. And he was going to claim that. And he said, if you want to protect that child, you got to stay within, stay enslaved to me. And she did. And so it's important to understand that Thomas Jefferson was a rapist. That's not, we're not judging him, that's what he did, I know, and that's what a lot of white slave owners, including a lot of our founding fathers, did. And if that's just depicting what happened. If you want to judge him or not, if you want to say, well, it was kind of, the social norm to rape, enslaved women back then. That's your issue, if you want to judge him or not, if you want to do presentism or not. But the simple fact is we have to still call it what it is. That's not whitewashing. You cannot have, mutual relationship with a 14-year-old enslaved person. That's, yeah. So it's important. So fine. You want to judge them. You don't want to judge them. That's totally up to you. But you still need to say what is actually happening, and don't water it down with, he just owns some property that happened to be human beings. Don't water. And that's the problem, is we try to water this down with this presentism. So that's one form of whitewashing. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes this: the point of this language of intention and personal responsibility is broad exoneration. Mistakes were made, bodies were broken, people were enslaved. We meant well, we tried our best. Good intention is a hall pass through history, a sleeping pill that ensures a dream. Another concept I want to talk about is historiography. So this is important to understand. So historiography, I mean, this is a really important concept. So historiography is essentially the study of history. And it's not just, it's also the study of how history is written, how history, captures different perspectives, how, subjectivity, historians bring in when they're writing history. So it's the idea of kind of looking at, what's the intentions of writing, certain points. And this is, we talked a little bit about this already, but this particularly comes in mention if we're taking a top down or a bottom up, perspective on history. So top down is how, essentially how most of our educational curriculum looks at. We don't look at, like we don't look at World War II on how, that affected, either peasants' perspectives, or the commoners' perspective. We look at, generals and presidents and dictators and their perspective. So same with like, that like the creation, the Declaration of Independence. We look at that through the colonial elite perspective. So our founding fathers were the elite people in colonial times. I mean, they were the super rich. They're the ones with the most rights. And through their eyes, they were doing this amazing experiment on democracy. They're they were just. They were fighting tyranny. I mean, that's that beautiful story that we tell about the creation of this country. And not to say that story wasn't true, but there needs to be room for other truths as well. And so if we do a bottom-up perspective on Declaration of Independence, we look at the social hierarchy and look at, well, who's on the bottom of the social hierarchy? Enslaved people, women, the indigenous. What did the Declaration of Independence mean for them? What did the creation of this country that had a constitution that not only legalized slavery, but gave extra representation through the 3/5 clause in the electoral college? It gave extra representation to slave states, which allowed the agenda around slavery and protecting slavery to dominate the birth of this country. So what did that mean to the enslaved people? What did that mean to indigenous people? Indigenous people, I mean, not to say British were good at all for indigenous people, but British were holding the line, on Western expansion. They had a proclamation like 1783 or something like that. I can't remember the exact name, but it was basically, it was a treaty with the native indigenous folks that said that they wouldn't allow their colony to expand past the Appalachian Mountains. But that was one of the first things, when the Declaration of Independence was declared and the war was declared on Britain, that was one of the first things they got rid of. And they immediately started expansion because a lot of our founding fathers had land investments in places like Ohio, and they were wanting to, they were investing because they were expecting to ethnically cleanse the area of indigenous people and then make a lot of money. And then that proclamation came about and stopped them. So, looking at, what is, the Declaration of Independence meant for indigenous people, what did it mean for women, who, this new patriarchal society. I mean, it was very similar to the old patriarchal society, but it just continued the fact that they still had no rights in this country. So when you look on the bottom up, you see a whole different narrative, and they're all truths. It's not about, one versus the other, but it's about understanding. If you're not, learning about, if you're only learning about the perspective of this country through our founding fathers and not through enslaved people's perspective, so you're getting a very whitewashed, perspective on what's happening, and it almost looks like this was like this amazing thing that happened when in reality, a lot of people suffered from the creation of this country, and you can even connect that to a lot of suffering that's happening still to this day. Again, it's not about a competition of what's negative versus positive. It's about understanding the realities of our country and then figuring out how to best fix it. And we can't do that unless we see everyone's perspectives. Another part about historiography is do we focus on the intentions of the actors in our history, or do we focus on the outcomes? And this is a big one as well, because we think about whether, a lot of people argue whether our country was created as a slaveocracy. So slaveocracy is a country that's basically the the majority of the power of the government, relies within slaveholders. And some people will argue, well, we talked a lot about this in the last class. There was a lot of reasons why, like the South wasn't really on board with this whole, independence movement until it looked like slavery was going to be outlawed in British colonies. And at that point, Benjamin Franklin and a bunch of people assured them that slavery would still remain legal if they joined. So they joined. And then even they created this. And the outcome was they created a constitution that gave an enormous amount of power to slaveholders. So in that extent, you can look at, oh yeah, the outcome was a slaveocracy. But then a lot of people will argue, well, majority of the people pushing for independence, a lot of them weren't slave owners. A lot of them were from the North. It wasn't about slavery to them. So they wanted to create a new, government, a democracy. So they had these intentions of they never, cared about slavery. They cared about, creating this new country. And that may have been their intention. So we could either focus on their intentions. They wanted to create this beautiful, democracy, or we could focus on the outcome, which the reality is they created a country that legalized and protected slavery for much longer than it would have, been. So it's all about, do you want, are you looking at the intent or are you looking at the outcome? And I like this quote that kind of summarizes that revolutions are measured by results as well as intentions, by effects as well as causes. And I really like this meme. This is from her, I don't know who Jodie Cantor is, but this is from her daughter's class, and it says, always ask yourself who's writing the stories, who's benefiting from the stories, who is missing from the stories. And that's essentially, that's historiography, is like understanding how our history is written and who benefits and who doesn't, benefit from it. All right, so I want to, this is a little bit long quote. I pulled this from a really amazing article, but I want to read it because it's actually 2 slides, but it's just some powerful, a powerful message. So I'm going to read this from Hasan Kwame Jeffries, who writes The Courage to Teach Hard History. Some say that slavery was our country's original sin, but it is much more than that. Slavery is our country's origin. The enslavement of indigenous people allowed the British and Spanish and other European colonizers to gain a foothold in the Americas. The enslavement of Africans propelled the growth of jewels in the crown of England. And slavery, together with the disposition of indigenous people, was a driving power behind the new nation's territorial expansion and industrial maturation, making the United States a mighty force in the Americas and beyond. Slavery was also our country's Achilles heel, responsible for its near undoing. When the southern states seceded, they did so expressly to preserve slavery. So wholly independent were the white Southerners on the institution that they took up arms against their own to keep the African Americans in bondage and to prevent the prohibition of slavery in Western lands taken from the native nations. White Southerners simply could not allow a world in which they did not have the absolute authority to control black labor and indigenous land. The central role that slavery played in the development of the United States is beyond dispute. And yet we, the people, do not like to talk about slavery or even think about it, much less teach or learn about it. The implications of doing so unnerves us. If James Madison, the principal architect of the Constitution, could hold people in bondage his entire life, refusing to free a single soul even upon his death, then what does that say about our nation's founders, about our nation itself? Slavery is hard history. It's hard to make sense of genocide that started it. It is hard to comprehend the humanity that defended it or defined it. It's hard to discuss the violence that sustained it. It's hard to teach the ideology of white supremacy that justified it. And it is hard to learn about those who abided it. We, the people, have a deep-seated aversion to hard history because we are uncomfortable with the implications it raises about the past as well as the present. So we pretend that the most troubling parts of our past simply do not exist. We ignore the fact that slavery prevailed in Massachusetts as well as in Mississippi. We rationalize evil, dismissing Thomas Jefferson's sexual predations with the enslaved girl Sally Hemings, who bore him 6 children, as a wistful May-December romance rather than what it was, rape. Indeed, we reveal it as a thought of Jefferson's proclaiming all men are created equal, but ridicule the prospects of Hemings declaring me too. Or we fabricate a history. We conjure up false narratives about secession, reimagine traitors as national heroes, and insisting that the cornerstone of the Confederacy was something other than slavery. So this is a continuation of, sorry, it's just such a powerful article. So I'm just going to read this last bit of it. We, the people, are much more comfortable with the Disney version of history, in which villains are easily spotted, suffering never lasts long, heroes invariably prevail, and life always gets better. We prefer to pick and choose what aspects of the past to hold on to, gladly jettisoning that which makes us uneasy. We would rather suspend reality watching the animated Pocahontas than trouble our minds with real engine and eye-opening documentary of Hollywood's repugnant portrayal of indigenous people. Our discomfort with hard history and our fondness for historical fiction also leads us to make bad public policy. We choose to ignore the fact that when slavery ended, white Southerners carried the mindset of enslavers with them into the post-emancipation period, creating new exploitative labor arrangements such as sharecropping, new disenfranchisements, mechanisms, including literary tests and new discriminatory social systems, namely Jim Crow. It took African Americans more than a century to eliminate these legal barriers to equality, but that hasn't been enough. But that has not been enough to erase race-based disparities in every aspect of American life, from education to employment to wealth and well-being. In much the same way we turn a blind eye towards the federal government's dismissive, discriminatory treatment of indigenous people, which continued long after the land grabs of the early 19th century and forced the relocation of native nations from their ancestral homes as part of the Trail of Tears. As a result, public policies tend to treat disparities involving African Americans and indigenous people as simply a product of poor personal decision-making, rather than acknowledging that they are a result of racialized systems and structures that restrict choice and limit opportunity. Understanding American slavery is vital to understanding racial inequality today. The formal and informal barriers to equal rights erected after emancipation, which defined the perimeters of a color line for more than a century, were built on the foundation constructed during slavery. Our narrow understanding of the institution, however, prevents us from seeing this long legacy and leads policymakers to try to fix people instead of addressing the historical rooted causes of the problems. So yeah, I mean, there's a reason why I included this very long, and then the article is even longer. Definitely check out the article. It's just such a powerful article. Not only to the fact that it talks about, like, we don't teach the right history. We don't teach people that our country was founded on slavery and indigenous genocide. We don't teach any of that stuff. Instead we teach this fabrication that was a beautiful experiment in democracy. And we glorify our founding fathers, and that's and that's important to understand. We're not just being critical just to be critical. We're being critical of our foundation because our foundation continued. These beliefs, that had to exist, this white supremacy beliefs and black inferiority beliefs and anti-indigenous beliefs were institutionalized even after slavery ended, and continue, and built the foundations of our criminal justice system, of our education system, of our housing systems, and they carry that racism with it, and we see this directly in the effect of the racial disparities that are felt today. So it's important to understand that, I mean, we're not just being critical just to be critical. We need to understand the bad parts of our history so we understand where we are today. But instead, when we whitewash all this stuff and we make it ultimately, like this last line, it ultimately, it places the blame not on addressing the historical rooted cause of the problems, but it leads policymakers to try to fix people. We start, pushing this myth, and this was particularly after the 1960s. There was this myth pushed that, after the civil rights bills, everything was fixed. So now, if black people were struggling, it's just because of their own, their own personal responsibility or lack of, or their culture, or their, absentee black father myth that was made up. So, and that's important because those myths, aren't just like random fabrications. Those are pushed by policymakers because who want to actually avoid initiating policies like reparations that actually that actually focus on actually healing the past harms that this country has done, and actually healing the harms that are still being caused today by the legacy. So that's why it's important. It's not, like I say, we're not just being negative to being negative. We're trying to help people understand our history so people can understand the right policies that we can move forward with to finally let go of the legacy of our history. All right. So another big myth that we have is this idea that our country has just gradually been making racial progress. And if you look back, yes, we have had progress, with racism and sexism and a lot of different oppressive institutions. We have made progress, overall, but and a lot of it's some of us we've made significant progress as well, but we also have to understand that it hasn't just been this like this continual line of progress. And anything it's much more fluid, and oftentimes we've had a lot of uh, we had a lot of we had a lot of moments that regressions. We've had a lot of times where we feel like we're fixing something like slavery. In fact, it just like what that's reality, racism fluidly adjusts to prevailing norms and interests. So for example, we had this 400 years of slavery, or 200 years, 250 years, give or take, in this country, and then a bunch of years, but yeah, I'm sorry, 250 years of slavery. Um, and then we act like, oh well, then we fixed it, but as Bree Newsom Bass says, we didn't abolish it, we just reformed it. So immediately we had this brief moment of reconstruction, this attempt to fix slavery, but then that fell apart because of white supremacy, took back the South. And then we had Jim Crow and segregation, felony disenfranchisement, white terrorism, convict leasing, all these new systems that involved into mass incarceration and war on drugs. All of this is directly stemmed from the racism that was created to justify slavery and justify white supremacy. So in reality, I mean, slavery, a lot of people say, oh, we overcame slavery. Many people argue that we did not at all. We just transformed it, and we're still dealing with the same, motivations that justified slavery. We're still dealing with it that's justifying mass incarceration and felony disenfranchisement. So it's important to understand this, like, to realize that our country, our history has not just been this gradual progression of getting better. And this is a really great quote. Julia Delacroix, wrote that's about the myth of continuous racial progress. She wrote, "The problem with the Disney version of history." She wrote, "Far too often, though, the history of race and racism is represented as a story of continuous progress. As TT staff writer Koshandra Dillard explains, the overall narrative of Black history goes something like this: America overcame slavery. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. helped usher in new civil rights laws, and then we elected our first Black president." According to our Teaching Hard History report, we're going to talk a little bit more about that report later. This focus on progress, the idea of a nation that faced down its sins and fought off its demons, is as common as it is problematic. The report identifies the idea as one of the key problems in the current pedagogy around American slavery. We tend to subscribe to a progressive view of American history that acknowledge flaws only to the extent that they have been addressed and solved. To insist on a history of continuous racial progress is to neglect an honest accounting of the fits and starts, the half steps and missed opportunities that come with any struggle for justice. The idea of continuous racial progress isn't merely inaccurate, it's harmful. Those disparities which persist today are further exacerbated by public policies that tend to treat racial inequality as a product of poor personal decision making rather than acknowledging it as a result of racialized systems and structures that restrict choice and limit opportunity. Downplaying or erasing the periods when the nation moved away from justice does little to help our students understand the present day impact of structures that uphold injustice. And definitely those last two paragraphs, again, just plays this point of just being honest with our history, so we can be honest with the policies that we need to fix the legacies of our history that we're feeling even today. And a great example of this is the Kerner Commission. So we're going to talk more about the Kerner Commission, I believe, in next class. Or one of the next two classes. But the Kerner Commission basically was just it came out because of in the second half in the 1960s there was what we call urban rebellion. Some people call them riots. It depends on your perspective. But these rebellions or riots broke out in hundreds of cities. Around 700 different civil disturbances occurred in mainly predominantly Black areas, and from Harlem riots, the Watts, Detroit, Chicago, DC, Baltimore, Uh, I mean, the year that MLK was assassinated, over 100 cities erupted in violence, and so Johnson, President Johnson at the time, he formed what was called the Kerner Commission to kind of research, what caused all this to happen, what was the solution, to stop this from happening again. So after a year of analyzing this, they came back and they reported that basically it was black people were rising up against this white supremacy that they were living in. The report talks about the nation says what the nation was moving toward two societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal. It talked about a system of apartheid that black people were all the things that they had to face, and the fact that they lived in horrific housing in most of these cities. They lived in had bad schools, were treated were brutalized by police. They found that and that the two big things was police brutality that caused a lot of these riots or rebellions, and it was also just like the lack of resources and the concentrated poverty that racial discrimination and racial especially housing discrimination was forcing these black people to live in. So it was they were fighting back against this white supremacy, and the report was real clear, and they're like, we need two things: we need police reform, and we need legislation we need huge investments into these communities, that to make up for the lack of disinvestments or the disinvestments that they were incurring for the last 100 years. Unfortunately, Johnson, that was not what he wanted to hear. He had launched his war on poverty, and he thought he was like bankrupting everything with his war in Vietnam, and then all of a sudden he was being told you need to spend more money and then take on the police unions and things like that. So instead, he found other people to write other reports and came up with his own solution, which was basically he launched the war on crime, which instead of reforming police, he just gave them a whole bunch of more funding, which eventually led to the war on drugs and rise of mass incarceration. So this was a big starting point for a lot of that. It was really unfortunate, but so that last year was the 50th year of or at least 2 years ago it was the 50th anniversary of the Kerner report. So there was this other report that came out. The Economic Policy Institute, did a research and saying, well, what has happened? What are the differences between 1968, when basically over 100 cities erupted, black communities, revolted against the conditions they were forced to be living in, and then so we wanted to see, has that gotten better? What has gotten better and what hasn't in the last 50 years? And they found a couple things have gotten better and a couple things didn't. I think one thing that has gotten better is education. So black people today are much better educated. It's like, in 68, it was something like, just over half of black people received, graduate high school. Now we're up to like 90% of black people to graduate high school. So that, that was a huge improvement. But when you look at, that compared to, how much white people have improved over the last 50 years, we still, it paints a different picture. Black people are still more than 2 times as likely to have a college degree. Since 68, but are still half as likely as young whites to have a college degree. So even though they're progressing, the gap between black and white people is remaining the same, and in many instances is actually getting wider as well. So, but because of the education that we know that results into better wages, better incomes, wealth, health, all these things for black people by getting, by having a better education and getting a better job and being able to get make more money. But so we have seen improvements in all these things: wages, incomes, wealth, health outcomes have improved. But at the same time, they haven't improved on par with white people's improvements. Black workers still only make 82 cents on the dollar earned for every dollar white workers work. African American are still 2.5 times likely to be in poverty as whites. The median white family has almost 10 times as much wealth as a median black family. And some of that has improved those disparities, but those are still significant, huge disparities. So although, they've been improving on these things, the disparities between white and black, the racial wealth gaps and things haven't improved that much. But then there's a couple of things that have not improved at all, and actually have gotten, some of the things gotten worse. And those three things are black home ownership, black unemployment, and black incarceration rates. So in 2017, the black unemployment rate was 7.5%, as compared to 6.7% in 1968. Still roughly 2 times the white employment rate. In 2015, the black home ownership was just over 40%, which is basically about the same. I mean, it did gain. Black home ownership did gain a lot, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s. But then the 2008 recession, because of reverse redlining and because of banking discrimination, because banks, had, literal, like Wells Fargo and these banks had literal policies that forced black people into really bad, subprime loans, black people that should have qualified for normal loans. And then, so when the recession hit and the bubble burst and people were losing their jobs, black people basically lost all their gains since '68 in this recession, and black people lost way more in this last recession than white people, and that was because of banking discrimination, and it's basically returned us back to '68 levels. And then as for jail, I mean, just with the rise in mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and all these things, the percentage of black people in jail has more than tripled since 1968. It's currently 6 times more than white incarceration rates. So this myth that this myth that we sell, this narrative that we've been slowly progressing. Yes, I mean there has been progression. I mean the fact that slavery is outlawed and redlining is outlawed, and there's different things that have been outlawed, and Jim Crow is no longer. These are all great things. These are all huge progresses. But at the same time, it's a myth to say that everything's just gradually getting better. In reality, some things are not getting better, and again, we need to own up to this if we're going to ever fix it. All right, sorry. This is so. This section has more quotes or article sections and other sections, but I apologize. But this is another form of whitewashing I want to talk about. And this was particularly done in the Nixon and Reagan eras. So this was after the civil rights era. And this is Eduardo Bonneville Silva, wrote Racism Without Racists. He talks a lot about this. It's how we, adapted racism to be certain, to kind of whitewash our history. And this was because there was intentions behind this. After the 3 1960 civil rights bills, the 1964 Civil Rights Act that outlawed Jim Crow, 65 Voter Rights Act, 68 Fair Housing Act. After those acts, it was really up to the courts to kind of set the precedents and to define what discrimination meant. And unfortunately, Nixon flooded the courts with very conservative judges that found lots of ways to kind of rewrite this and to make it almost impossible to prosecute discrimination cases and things like that, and they redefine not only our racism but the history of white supremacy in this country during these time periods. So I'm just going to read this passage. It's going to do a better job than me summarizing, but. Both the Nixon and Reagan administrations, which with the support of Berger and Rehnquist's Supreme Courts, executed 2 significant tasks to crush the promise embedded in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965. The first was to refine what the movement was really about. With centuries of oppression and brutality suddenly reduced to a harmless symbolism of a bus seat and a water fountain. Thus, when the colored-only signs went down, inequality has supposedly disappeared. By 1965, Richard Nixon asserted almost every legislative roadblock to equality of opportunity for education, jobs, and voting has been removed. Also magically removed by this interpretation were up to $24 trillion in multi-generational devastation that African Americans had suffered in lost wages, stolen land, educational impoverishment, housing inequalities. All that vanished as if that never happened. Or as Pat Buchanan, advisor to Richard Nixon and presidential candidate himself, would explain decades later, America has been the best country on earth for Black folks. It was here that 600,000 Black people brought from Africa to slave ships grew into a community of 40 million, were introduced to Christian salvation, and reached the greatest levels of freedom and prosperity Blacks had ever known. Similarly, shadowed slavery, which built the United States inordinate wealth, molded into an institution which few, if any, whites had ever benefited because their families never owned slaves. Once the need for the civil rights movement was minimized and history rewritten, initiatives like President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and Affirmative Action, which were developed to commemorate hundreds of years of violent and corrosive repression, were easily characterized as reverse discrimination against hardworking whites and a government handout that lazy Black people chose to take rather than work. So I want to stop here and just talk a little bit about this first passage. Was this idea that now after the civil rights movements had passed, Nixon asserted that now all legislative roadblocks to equality and opportunity for education, jobs, and voting had been removed. So that was it. They kind of sold this myth that a lot of people bought into, that racism was fixed at this point. And that all this past harm, even though the civil rights, bills didn't address past harm, they didn't, address the enormous head start white people got from centuries of Black oppression. They didn't address any, indigenous, ethnic cleansing, any of that stuff. They just said, now, after centuries of this horrific shit, we're just going to say it was wrong. We're going to stop it from going, and then we're going to pretend like everything's fine. And they even left huge loopholes for de facto discrimination, like, different forms of redlining and housing discrimination and banking discrimination that is still happening to this day. That doesn't seem like it's very race neutral. It doesn't seem like discrimination, like exclusionary zoning policies. Like, I want to just have single family unit housing in my neighborhood. It doesn't seem racial at all, but the outcome is, Black people who have been historically disenfranchised can't afford to move into your community now. So there's all these, like, so left all, not only did not fix past harm, but also left, a lot of, ways for future discriminations to occur. So selling this narrative that everything was fixed, and that, Pat Buchanan saying that, Black people, didn't, 600,000 Black people brought to African ships, that America was the best country on earth for them, claiming that Africa was this horrific place, which is, again, some colonial bullshit, so again, these narratives they're pushing are all false narratives, but the end result of these narratives is you have a bunch of white people that don't feel like we need no reparations, or we don't need any more reforms or civil rights reforms or anything like that. And now they look at any kind of attempt for civil rights or equality in this country as reverse discrimination. And then on the second part, the second key maneuver, which flowed naturally from first, was to redefine racism itself. Confronted with civil rights headlines depicting unflattering portrayals of KKK rallies and jackbooted sheriffs, white authorities transformed into damning images of white supremacy. And to the sole definition of racism, this simple but wickedly brilliant conceptual linguistic shift served multiple purposes. First, foremost, it was a conscious soothing. The whittling down of racism to sheet-wearing goons allowed a cloud of racial innocence to cover many whites who, although resentful of Black progress and determined to ensure that racial equality remained untouched, could see and protect themselves as a kind of upstanding white citizens who were positively outraged at the tactics of the Ku Klux Klan. The focus of the Klan also helped to designate racism as an individual aberration rather than something systemic, institutional, or pervasive. Moreover, isolating racism to only its most violent and visible form allowed respectable politicians and judges to push for policies that ostensibly met the standard of American civil rights norms, while at the same time crafting the implementation of policies that undermine the destabilize these norms, all too often leaving Black communities ravaged. So we talked a lot about this during the last class, the political right class, on how, due to racial dog whistles and the Southern strategy, the modern Republican Party created this new way to push racist policies like segregation without making it seem so racist, like using states' rights, or law and order, or calling immigrants and asylum seekers illegals, all these things to kind of make it seem like make people, to capture this white vote to create, to make it, to continue pushing racist policies while making everyone seem like it's not that racist. We just want some law and order, when in fact law and order, Nixon used that as a racial dog whistle to kind of whitewash the fact that he was brutally, brutalizing and suppressing civil rights activists. So on the last part, the objective was, these last two paragraphs, the objective was to contain and neutralize the victories of the civil rights movement by painting a picture of the colorblind equal opportunity society whose doors were now wide open. If only African Americans would take initiative and walk on through. All right, so I know that was a lot of words, but and I definitely recommend rereading these paragraphs. But this is some of the most important paragraphs that I found in all my classes. With this passage, it just perfectly summarizes how even after we had this racial progress, the civil rights movement, the backlash, the white lash to this. Is we created a whole new movement of repression around this post-racial, race-neutral racism, and while still pushing the same racist policies, but making everyone seem like they weren't racist, and that racists were only like these, crazy KKK people. All right, so sorry, that was a lot of words, so I appreciate it. So I really like this, Dara Kafari, she writes, the way Americans teach racism as an individual character flaw rather than a defining characteristics of American policy makes it much easier to gaslight people of color. I think that's a much simpler way to say what Edouard wrote, just summarize and all those words in the last slide. So the last thing I want to talk about is just I want to talk about Dr. King, because I think Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., is just such a perfect example of how we've whitewashed our history. So a lot of people, if you're like me, we grew up, hearing about Martin Luther King. We hear about his success with the Montgomery boycott, the bus boycott, and then we'd always hear his speech, I Have a Dream speech. And that speech was, at least the main part of it was all about this idea that, if everyone just was treated equally, and we all looked at each other as human beings, then we could fix all this racism and fix white supremacy. But in reality, so we sell this image that Dr. King had this this dream about and that helped usher in the civil rights bills, and the civil rights bills fixed racism, and now anyone any black person complaining about systemic racism is really just they just need to take more responsibility for themselves, and that's the typical message. We sell this idea that love and good intentions is all we need to answer injustice, not like dismantling white supremacy or economic justice or reparations or anything like that. It's just we just needed love and good intentions. And the reality was, even though this is how I learned about Dr. King, I imagine this is how a lot of other people learned about. But the reality is that just did not happen. Dr. King himself, talked about, after the first two civil rights bills were passed, that his dream, ultimately became a nightmare. He realized that that there would never be justice, and there would never be healing in this country until there was economic justice, if there was reparations, there was political justice. He talked a lot about, his last couple of years of organizing, he organized around economic restructuring. He organized the Poor People's Campaign to try to get Congress to start doing massive investments into poverty, and huge relocation of wealth in this country. Yeah, I mean, he like if you look at, we talked a lot about, he was not what Martin Luther King was not well liked during, while he was alive. This is a report from American Self-Reported First Reactions to MLK being killed, and 31% of them, felt he brought it on himself. Um, and we often use this, but it's very intentional because we use this whitewashing King, this thing that I mean, he was an advocate of nonviolence, but he also was an advocate against negative pieces, and he preached often about the dangers of letting people tone police your movements, and that if there's no actual real justice, then this call for peace can actually do more harm than good. And that's often used when we see Black people rising up against their oppressive situations, and if they if that turns violent, or if there's a riot that breaks out of this property damage, everyone's like, oh, this isn't what King would do. We need to listen to King. In reality, I mean, King would support this. I mean, he was famous for saying a riot is the language of the unheard, and what it is that America has failed to hear, and it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. I mean, if you read his letters from Birmingham jail, I mean, most of his letters are like talking about how white moderates that are so fixed on negative justices and false tranquility are some of the biggest threats to racial progress. But at the same time, the same white moderates today, every Martin Luther King Day, they bust out their quotes, and really manipulate his perspective to kind of justify policies that he would actually be opposed to. I want to read this article from Candace Benbow that wrote "The Gentrification of MLK: How America Intentionally Misrepresented Our Radical Civil Rights Leader." So white Americans love to paint Dr. King as a passive, nonviolent Christian who had a dream and believed racial unity was possible if everyone worked together. This King makes them feel good about their levels of inaction. He assumes whatever guilt they might have about not doing enough to hold their own family members and colleagues accountable for their bigotry, because he calls for those with less power to do as much as work as powerful. Their version of Dr. King does not mind when his words are intentionally taken out of context to justify reconciliation without accountability. Yet their sanitized version of Martin Luther King Jr. is not who he was at all. Dr. King was a radical. Heavily quoted are his assertions that hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great of a burden to bear. Both coming from his keynote at the 11th annual Southern Church SCLC, I forget the acronyms, convention. It had to do with the Southern Church organization, but a convention in 1967. Again, love is rendered as some passive act that enables abuse. To love someone in King's estimation, according to those who misread him, is to remain silent about the unjust work of the powerful and to pray for someone else to come to the rescue. Love, then, is absent of all accountability and truth-telling, two things Dr. King championed. Though many would disagree with his optimism, Dr. King's love for America and belief in the country's potential to be great wasn't rooted in a nonviolence that perpetually rendered him inferior. In that same speech titled "Where Do We Go From Here?", Dr. King explains why love is necessary. Now we got to get this thing right. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. Loving Dr. King is easy for America now that he's gone. They took him away from us, and now they take his sound bites, pair them with the noticeable strides made in race relations, and rewrite the history that makes it clear we could be further along if they had only listened to him the first time. Whitewashing Dr. King's radical legacy to make him more palpable is to the masses works to alleviate America's conscience and sell the lie that we are post-racial. All right. So I'm going to play this a short interview with Dr. King when he actually talks about how his dream turned out to be a nightmare.
I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream. I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare. Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future. But I've had to analyze many things over the last few years, and I would say over the last few months. I've gone through a lot of soul-searching and agonizing moments. And I've come to see that we have many more difficult days ahead, and some of the old optimism was a little superficial, and now it must be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go. I think the biggest problem now is that we got our gains over the last 12 years at bargain rate, so to speak. It didn't cost the nation anything. In fact, it helped the economic side of the nation to integrate lunch counters and public accommodations. It didn't cost the nation anything to get the right to vote established. Now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now, I think this is where we're getting our greatest resistance. They may put it on many other things, but we can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something.
All right. And this is another great account to follow, The Mirror. Really great stuff on Instagram. But he did this whole bit on whole thread on different amazing radical quotes from King. Like we already talked about the one when he talked about the riots, but like this one: if peace means a willingness to be exploited economically, dominated politically, humiliated, and segregated, I don't want peace. If peace means being complacently adjusted to the deadening status quo, I don't want peace. If peace means keeping my mouth shut in the midst of injustice and evil, I don't want it. Peace is not simply the absence of conflict, but the existence of justice for all, which is like completely different than a lot of quotes that are used today by white people describing about how he just wants peace and everything else should be sacrificed. Or even like, Martin Luther King was very anti-capitalist and really pulled out the evils around, that come from capitalism, which is not something we teach at all. But he wrote this one: the evils of capitalism are as real as the evils of militarism and racism. The problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without radical redistribution of political and economic power. I'll read this last one. White Americans must recognize that justice for Black people cannot be achieved without radical changes in the structure of our society. So this is the real Dr. King. He was a radical. He was an anti-capitalist. He was calling for a radical redistribution of wealth and political power. And this is ultimately what got him killed. And it's a shame that we don't teach this. It's a shame that we teach only that I have a dream and everything would be better if we just love each other more. You can't love away the need for reparations. You can't love away the need for like institutional change and distribution of wealth. So it's just a shame that we don't teach this part of Dr. King. I'll read this quote. This is Brian Stevenson. He wrote this, the director of the Equal Justice Initiative. He wrote that the two largest high schools in Montgomery are Robert E. Lee High and Jefferson Davis High is a manifestation of this failure to confront history. That people are actually trying to eliminate the Voting Rights Act is a manifestation of this history. That people resent when we talk about bias and discrimination because they think that's all we talk about is a manifestation of this history. I think it's hard to find things that are not implicated by our failure to deal with the history more honestly.